Friends and colleagues. He's also someone whose ideas I particularly follow. His theory about network journalism and his coining of that term, network journalism, absolutely expresses many of the ideals which I share. I'm only frustrated that he thought of that phrase first. He does the theory, I do some of the practice. The only disadvantage of us appearing on the same platform is that occasionally we agree too much. So I hope maybe this afternoon we'll be able to have some disagreement, or we'll have some questions from the floor that will get a proper debate going. I thought I'd illustrate my theme today by starting with a video which shows how the BBC has covered some of those recent enormous events in the Arab world that Charlie mentioned. I'd like you to look at it, and as you watch it, assess what features that we're showing do you think might be novel for an international news organisation. Let's have a look at the video.
Some sort of militia, men armed with clubs, are on the first floor of the hotel, 4 floors below. So that's really...
Joined here by one of my colleagues from the BBC Arabic service, Asad al-Asawi. He arrived just a short time ago in our office. I'm sorry, Asad, because you're bleeding, still bleeding profusely. Exactly what happened.
When a team from BBC Arabic tried on Monday to get through to Zawiya, they were stopped at a checkpoint and detained for 21 hours in 3 other locations. Correspondent Firas Kilani was badly beaten. Their bodies, they've been tortured. Yeah, sure.
From second floor, I heard a lot of screaming, and I can't describe it. It was horrible. The worst thing I've ever seen.
A single series of actions, they too coming over, bombing.
في وسط العاصمة المصرية القاهرة هذا الصباح سقوط عدد من المتظاهرين.
If there's any leader of this revolution, this is the Facebook. They organize themselves through the Facebook.
But how do the people show their authority then? Because some who've gone out onto the streets to protest say that your people have shot at them.
No demonstration at all in the streets. أنت شفت مظاهرات؟
Did you see demonstrations?
Yes, I have, yes.
Where?
I saw some today.
What was going on around you? A lot of patients, a lot of blood. We didn't even have enough time to make stitches.
Incredible, unprecedented scenes right here in the heart of the capital.
Just listen to this for a few seconds. It says it all.
Sorry about that. You've seen most of the video. You get the idea. So what might you've noticed from that? Certainly remarkable, brave coverage by the BBC's news teams in North Africa and the Middle East. And of course many other news organisations have had similarly impressive records in their response to the recent crisis. But striking as that personal bravery has been, it's not that I particularly wish to draw your attention to. I hope that you notice the prominence in much of that material of the BBC's non-English language teams. In particular, the work of the teams from BBC Arabic, as well as BBC Persian. Those two new television services, just 4 years and 2 years old, are now not just reporting to their own language audiences, but working right alongside the BBC News English teams. So you saw Assad Sawi in Egypt appearing injured with the blood, alongside English presenter Lise Doucet. But not only were those Arabic correspondents appearing when they'd been involved in trouble, but they appeared regularly on air, for instance giving eyewitness accounts of what was happening and providing in-depth analysis. And more recently in Libya, our Arabic service teams were operating in joint news-gathering units with the main BBC News, and of course in doing that, exposing themselves to significant risk, as you saw there with the interview clips of Feroz Kalani and Goktai Karatan, who were held and brutalised and tortured by the Gaddafi forces. So this approach of bringing our foreign language and English language journalists together means that we have individuals who come from those countries that we're reporting about, who speak the relevant languages fluently, and they work with our globally known English news teams. We have an increasingly bilingual workforce, able to operate in English as well as their own language. They're encouraged to report for television, radio and online, so we ask them to be multi in many ways, multimedia and multilingual. Those are the two new watchwords for the heart of the strategy for BBC Global News in the years ahead. We believe it's one of the most ambitious and innovative undertakings ever in international journalism, with some fascinating opportunities, but also some real risks. Today I want to set out why and how we're setting about that key strategy for our international services, which we call Becoming More Global. And I also want to show how I hope that other international news organisations will rise to that same challenge, as true international journalism is increasingly under threat. Now, why would the BBC be going to the trouble of ensuring its teams can work multilingually and making significant organisational changes to ensure we have the technology and culture to implement that? One obvious reason, and Charlie's touched on it, is efficiency, although that is a minor reason. We're certainly operating in a very tight financial environment. The BBC World Service has been going through a deep restructure following the United Kingdom government's spending review, which cut our funding by 16% and in turn required us to close 5 of our valuable language services. But the key reason for this change to multilingual and multimedia is not financial. It's because the BBC's global, impartial perspective is our greatest competitive advantage. Now, despite the fact that we still have the largest audience and the highest reputation globally of any international news provider, we are absolutely not complacent, and we cannot be complacent. In fact, we face greater competitive threats than ever before. But we believe that the unique advantages we have in having a workforce drawn from now 27 different language groups, supplementing our renowned English language news gathering operation, gives us an advantage that few other international news organisations can match. It's an advantage which we must now maximise and make relevant to our audiences. And I believe that any international news organisation is going to need to think very hard if it's to be competing in this genuinely global manner, rather than just exporting a single national news culture and approach to the rest of the world. So let me turn to that competitive environment. Whilst all the major international news organisations may appear impressive at a global level, for instance the BBC's current audience reach we estimate is 241 million people around the world. When you actually look in individual markets, we're relatively small. The strength of local news providers means that international news sources are increasingly seen as secondary. We know that in the bulk of our markets, audiences get their primary news from local providers, whether commercial or state funded. Even places like Afghanistan have now rapidly growing media sectors. It's estimated that there are now about 175 radio stations and 75 television stations operating in that country. However, in markets where there is a shortage of reliable, locally provided news, a significant minority will still turn to international news sources, as they do, for instance, to the BBC in great numbers in Afghanistan. And a larger number will use news from the BBC and other international sources as a secondary source after they've got local news. And then across all of our markets, there is a strong audience niche for people who have a confirmed interest in international news, i.e. those people who deliberately choose to go to international news. The people who have that desire aren't just wealthy members of the elite part of society. Instead, they can come from all sectors of society. They're typically characterised by curiosity, an outgoing mindset, an awareness that international events are increasingly impacting on their own lives. The younger audiences amongst this type are typified by having an optimistic outlook, seeking to understand their place in the world, even though they may never have had the opportunity to travel widely themselves. They're enthusiastic users of technology. Now, to fully understand our increasingly globalised world requires all of us to be aware of and to understand trends, themes and events from across the globe. And in recent months, the BBC has been reporting many surprising examples of how global stories can be directly relevant to audiences many miles away from where those stories happened. Take the events we were showing on the video. When the fighting started in Libya, one emerging story for our South Asian services was the plight of thousands of migrant workers stranded in Libya. For instance, whilst the government of Bangladesh was unable to mobilise efforts to get its citizens out, the BBC Bengali service for Bangladesh told the story of those migrant workers. It looked at their experience and challenged the response of government ministers. Of course, the economy is the classic global story that also has immense local relevance. Just last week, our African teams explored how the economic recession in America is affecting people's lives in Africa. Those reports told the story of African migrants who can't find jobs and as a result are turning their back on their unfulfilled American dream. And we're also experimenting in multilingual investigative journalism. A recent editorial season where we examined extremes in the world dug into the subject of corruption. An opinion poll conducted for us indicated that corruption was one of the primary concerns of our audience around the world. It's definitely an underreported subject, but one that played a key part in the political frustrations and those popular uprisings. But we tackled this theme well before the Middle East turmoil, because we were able to draw on the insights of that multinational team that we have. So if relevant global content is increasingly the mainstay and purpose of the BBC's journalism, how do we organise ourselves to deliver that? There's an explosion of state-funded international news. At the same time, there's a dramatic cutting back in resources by most commercial news organisations. China has announced a $7 billion expansion programme for its overseas media operations. That's more than 10 times greater than the budget that the BBC has. That expansion programme includes a massive increase in its foreign bureau. Now, the traditional international public service broadcasters in Europe and North America do make noble efforts to retain global news gathering and broadcasting. But of those, only the Voice of America really, and its sister organisations, have truly global scope. Voice of America has 44 languages. That's 17 more now than the BBC, although its audience reach is lower. The Voice of America is disadvantaged in comparison to the BBC, as it's got no alliance with an American-based partner of scale. National Public Radio in the United States has made impressive investments in journalism in recent years, and the public broadcasting system makes a commitment to international journalism as best it can afford. But those are totally separate organisations from the VOA. This lack of coherence across US public broadcasting hampers the United States from bringing the strength of its global language services facing the world together with a properly funded domestic news organisation. And that's a unique advantage that the BBC has got. Now, those new entrants into international state broadcasting, for instance from Russia and China, have got real financial muscle to be global in their distribution and their reach. However, they've hardly got the intention of being genuinely global editorially and in their mindset. Their purpose, at least so far, seems to be to develop news services that allow them to put a distinctly national slant on their coverage. CCTV's stated purpose is to, quote, voice a Chinese perspective on world affairs and to break the Western voice's monopoly on the news. Now, of course, that may well have appeal for audiences who want to understand a variety of perspectives. And in parts of the world where Chinese influence is increasing, there will probably be a growing market for that. But I genuinely doubt that many people from around the world will want to rely for a global view from broadcasters who are fundamentally one-sided. The other main news broadcasters with a genuinely global perspective are obviously CNN and Al Jazeera. And each of these is making impressive efforts to move from their nation-specific roots to be broader. CNN still reflects in its production style and in some of its editorial preoccupations its US origins, and for many around the world that remains a highly attractive offer. But it's also over the years increasingly developed news partnerships, for instance in India and Turkey, where its global content is adapted locally and content flows back to the global picture from its partners. CNN's marketing tag, Go Beyond Borders, pinpoints well the importance of globalism in their approach. Al Jazeera, of course, started from a particular Middle Eastern perspective, but it's said to make great strides in becoming more global with the launch of Al Jazeera English. Its editorial agenda and its talent recruitment have been diverse, and they're making strong efforts in throwing off the burden of the initial reputation they had. And Al Jazeera now broadcasts in Arabic and English, and has got plans for the Balkans and Turkey, amongst other territories. Of course, there are other truly international news organisations beyond the broadcasters. Just picking out a few, the New York Times and the UK's Daily Mail and Guardian have genuinely global ambitions in terms of their reach. However, none of these organisations has set out to produce a fully global agenda in the way I'm defining. For instance, the